Welcome back. So we've been talking about environmental justice and distribution as a form of justice, but I want to take a little bit of time here to talk about other types of justice, because we kind of ended it as saying the last video saying distribution is not the only type of justice, and in some ways you might say that there are other types of justice that need to come first. First, I want to point out a criticism. So, the distribution as a form of justice is probably the most common way of looking at justice. But one of the critiques there is that it's a focus on the development of ideal and fair processes for the distribution of goods and benefits. And you're sort of relying on this neutral or ideal way of the processes that dictate this distribution are ideal and fair. And if you know that its obvious conclusion is if you come to an unequal distribution, then there's something going on with the underlying processes. And so that's sort of the critique here, is that if you really want to understand what causes the unequal distributions and you want to fix them, then you need to understand the processes that led to them in the first place. And so, you have to ask questions like who is left out of the distributions, what causes unequal distributions, and how is unequal distribution produced by a society. And so you have to look at the systems and the underlying foundation within society. And I think that's getting a little abstract. And so I want to look at something a little more concrete. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to do with urban forestry, but we'll get there in a second. But I want to introduce the idea of recognition as justice. And one lens to look at this is through the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of current events that have been going on. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement, but if you're not, it's sort of this idea that there's this group of people, specifically Black and African Americans, and they are experiencing unequal treatment. There's unequal treatment by law enforcement groups, and there are certain groups that are being treated differently by the law enforcement system or the criminal justice system compared to other Americans. And I think they have evidence to back that up, but really, in terms of defining recognition as justice through this lens, I think these movements are trying to do a couple different things. One is obviously they want to bring about change to fix this issue that they see. But the second one, I think, and the one that has to come first, is they're just trying to bring attention to the issue itself, where it's saying, hey, there's something going on. And if we want to consider this right, criminal justice, maybe we're talking about the distribution of rights. They're not being distributed equally in the criminal justice system because there's this group that is not being treated like these other groups. And so that in itself is saying we need to acknowledge this, and that acknowledgement is the form of recognition as justice, that you need to recognize that there are inequalities that exist before you can even start to address what they might be and the extent to which they might exist. You have to be able to show that they do exist. And so I think that's ultimately what this movement is about, or at least partially about. And I think that's a really good example of recognition as a form of justice. And we can break recognition down into different components here. There's a psychological component, and this is going to get abstract for a second here again, but just bear with me. You can break it down to a psychological thing and say, are you as an individual experiencing a lack of recognition, and is that impacting your self-worth? And there are those who would argue, if not, then if you're not perceiving some lack of recognition, then there must not be one. And it gets a little philosophical, and I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but that's sort of where they're going with that idea. The other idea is what your status is, and I think it's kind of easier to wrap your head around this. Status in terms of you might be some cultural group, and in terms of cultural domination, let's say you're a group and you have certain customs and activities, and you are in a larger area which has other cultures in it, and maybe you're not the dominant culture. is the dominant culture sort of forcing you to assimilate, or are your customs and values and things recognized, and are you allowed to adhere to them or exhibit them in the way that you want to? If not, then that could be a form of cultural domination in which people might recognize that you're different, but the culture is not going to allow that. Invisibility is sort of different, where you're not even viewed as a group that exists. So it's just a complete lack of recognition. Um, and so your customs or beliefs or whatever they are not recognized at all. And so that's sort of a different, but both of those would sort of be forms of status in terms of are you recognized or not, and to what extent are you recognized and acknowledged. So let's bring this back to something that is relevant for this course, and that is different cultural groups and different religious groups can have a lot of preferences, and you may not know this, but they can have preferences for the types of trees that they want and how they take care of those trees. And so they might have pruning practices that can vary. They might have species preferences. They might want to plant specific types of trees. Um, and so that can cause some issues. So when I worked in Indianapolis, there was a group, and I think it was the Burmese refugees, but I'm having trouble remembering. But there was a minority group in a neighborhood in Indianapolis when I worked there, and they wanted to prune their trees in a certain way. And what you're seeing back here is pollarding. It's called pollarding, and it's a type of pruning practice for trees. And this group wanted to prune their trees, and they wanted to have certain types of trees that weren't on the official list of species, and wanted to prune them in ways that weren't necessarily healthy for the tree. And so we had to step back and say, well, this is a cultural thing for them. I think the important thing was, giving them information and saying, hey, what you want to do might harm these trees. It might lower their lifespans and things. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think that's what you do. And I'm a little bit biased because I worked there at the time, and I want to think we made the right decision. But basically, we gave them the information and said, here's what you're doing. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide if the cultural practices are more important than the health of the trees. But you have the information, so you can make that decision. That's sort of how this can manifest itself. Like the other side of the coin would be, you could come in here if you're a government or a municipality and say, hey, we don't like what you're doing to these trees. Even if this is some cultural thing for you, you're not allowed to do it this way. And so that might be a form of cultural domination or a lack of recognition, where we're just not, you may not recognize that as some cultural norm or preference for them, and you're going to come in and say, you're just not going to do it that way. So that you might not think that these things, they sound abstract, but they can manifest themselves in even in urban forestry. Something as simple, you might think of trees in a city. There's some interesting dynamics that can crop up. Um, the last thing I want to talk about here is something called procedural justice. And I think of this as sort of a feedback loop among some of the things that we've already talked about. So basically, an unequal distribution can produce inequalities that prohibit marginalized groups from participating in decision-making processes. And this can ultimately create more unequal distributions and lead to even greater inequality. So it's sort of a feedback loop where you have inequality from unequal distributions, which prohibits people. They can't participate in decision-making processes that might fix some of those inequalities, and so those things don't get fixed, and they get even worse. And so it's this feedback loop. And one way to think about this would be, maybe you have a neighborhood that doesn't have as many trees planted in it by the city. Maybe the people living in that neighborhood don't even know that the city plants trees, or maybe they don't know how to request a tree from the city, or maybe they don't know how to go to stakeholder meetings where they can make the point like, hey, our neighborhood could use some more trees. And so their neighborhood's not going to get more trees because they don't know how to participate in this decision-making process, because they may not even know that it exists because the city isn't planting trees in those neighborhoods. And so those sorts of things can create these feedback loops and ultimately cause more inequality, more unequal distributions, which feed into this whole thing. So that's sort of how I think about procedural justice. So there's a couple readings here. There's a 2018 paper that was published that sums up, I think, in a little bit probably better terms than what I was able to, how recognition and distributional justice sort of manifest themselves in terms of urban forestry and urban ecology. And then there's a story from Phoenix, Arizona, about urban heat that I'm going to have you read and then situate that within one of these types of justice that we've been talking about. So um, look out for those readings. Keep working your way through the module. But that's it for my videos, and I will see you next week.